Don't expect a single dollar of this estate, you idiot. My lawyer's going to bury you in court. My father's voice slammed across the civil courtroom so hard that even the clerk behind the desk stopped typing. A few people gasped softly. Someone in the back muttered, "Jesus Christ." I didn't react. At 78 years old, Richard Carter still knew how to command a room. Have you ever felt invisible in your own family? Drop a comment with where you're listening from and your current time. I'd love to know who's in our community. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was strictly clinical. While my father's threat still echoed off the heavy mahogany walls of the courtroom, I simply reached into my leather briefcase. I bypassed the tissues, ignored the hostile stares, and pulled out a thick, meticulously tabbed blue folder. This was no longer a family dispute. It was a balance sheet, and it was finally time to reconcile the accounts. I walked right past my father's table. I didn't look at him. I handed the pre-filed emergency injunction directly to the clerk, who nervously passed it up to the judge. It was a temporary restraining order, but it wasn't based on emotion, grievances, or hearsay. It was anchored by preliminary, irrefutable forensic evidence of offshore wire fraud, pages of routing numbers, time-stamped digital transfers, and hidden shell companies. The judge adjusted his glasses, his eyes scanning the first 3 pages of the docket. The heavy silence in the room shifted from dramatic shock to a suffocating, dangerous tension. My father's high-priced lawyer stood up to object, but the judge held up a single hand, silencing him instantly. He didn't ask for my father's input, having already reviewed the undeniable ex parte evidence in his chambers. He simply reached for his wooden gavel and struck the block. With that single, sharp crack, the primary offshore holding accounts of the Carter shipping empire were immediately and legally frozen. My father stared at me, the colour rapidly draining from his weathered face. He wasn't shocked by his own cruelty. He was shocked that I had stopped playing along. This exact moment had been 17 years in the making. At 18 years old, I was aggressively pushed out of the family estate. My absolute banishment was the standard penalty for refusing to bow to my father's transactional version of love. In his house, family affection was a binding contract and blind compliance was the only accepted currency. I had refused to sign the terms, so he immediately cut my funding and locked the doors. I became an unrecoverable asset, written off the family ledger, and entirely forgotten. While I navigated my abrupt exile, my older brother Tyler stepped effortlessly into the role of the spoiled golden child. He absorbed all the resources, the unearned praise, and the executive power. My father viewed Tyler as a blue-chip investment, pouring millions of dollars into his lavish, unchecked lifestyle, while convincing himself it was simply brilliant succession planning. I had been the silent investor in their twisted version of a family, but my compassion was a resource they had overdrafted for the very last time. I didn't waste my 20s waiting by the phone or hoping for a tearful apology. I used my isolation as capital. I built an elite forensic accounting firm from the ground up. I spent over a decade learning how to track hidden assets, dismantle complex corporate shells, and read the silent, undeniable stories that numbers tell. I trained myself to be cold, factual, and lethal in the boardroom. Standing in that courtroom, looking across the aisle at the man who had erased me and the brother who had so eagerly replaced me, I felt absolutely no grief. I rubbed my eyes, perhaps trying to summon a shred of regret, but there was only razor-sharp clarity. People often ask me why I finally came back after 17 years of complete silence. They assume I was desperate for closure or that I suddenly missed the toxic dynamic I'd escaped. But my return had absolutely nothing to do with nostalgia. It started 3 months ago at 2 a.m. with a single, heavily encrypted email. The message didn't have a subject line. It came from a terrified senior comptroller inside the Carter shipping empire, a lifelong employee who had watched my father build the company from a single rusted barge into a Boston institution. The insider was desperate, risking their own career because they couldn't stomach what was happening on the inside. Attached to the email was a compressed file containing raw, unfiltered internal ledgers. I didn't panic when I opened the spreadsheets. I just started reading the data. Numbers are brutally honest, they don't manipulate, and they never gaslight. Within 20 minutes, The narrative was undeniable. Tyler wasn't just mismanaging the company, he was methodically bleeding it dry. For the past 4 years, my brother had been systematically siphoning millions of dollars out of the operational budget. He was burying the theft under inflated vendor invoices, phantom logistics, consulting fees, and aggressive write-offs. I watched the time-stamped transfers flow out of the payroll accounts and directly into Tyler's private wealth management funds. He was buying luxury real estate and exotic cars while telling our father they needed to freeze employee pensions to survive the quarter. The audacity was almost impressive, but it was purely criminal. Every night I sat alone in my office, compiling the evidence into a devastatingly precise dossier. There was no sadness in the late hours. There was no despair over the family I never had. Anger wasn't loud. It was clinical. Tyler had convinced the old man that the shipping industry was collapsing, that their competitors were crushing them, and that the devastating losses were just unavoidable market casualties. My father, whose mind was beginning to slow with age, believed every word. He thought his empire was dying a natural death. He had no idea his golden child was the one holding the pillow over its face. I spent the next 3 months conducting a silent, invisible audit from my own office. I didn't hire a private investigator, and I certainly didn't call the family. I just opened my laptop and went to work. I tracked every fraudulent wire transfer, unspooled every Delaware shell company, and traced the digital breadcrumbs all the way to a series of offshore accounts. It was a masterclass in entitlement. Tyler was so arrogant, so deeply convinced of his untouchable status that he had gotten sloppy. He left a paper trail a mile wide, assuming no one in his inner circle would ever dare to question him. He forgot that the daughter they had completely written off was now a professional at dismantling financial architectures exactly like his. This wasn't about saving the father who had banished me. It was about correcting a fundamental imbalance. My family had spent my entire childhood treating my worth like a depreciating asset. Now, I held the absolute monopoly on the truth. I had spent 90 days quietly building a watertight federal level case against my brother. I didn't come to civil court to argue about my inheritance or to demand an apology. I came to foreclose on their entire reality. Despite the gavel strike temporarily freezing the offshore accounts, Tyler failed to calculate the immediate danger. Assuming his high-priced lawyer would easily quash the temporary order by lunch, his arrogance remained a fatal structural defect, a massive blind spot manufactured by 40 years of zero consequences. He simply leaned back in his heavy leather chair, crossing his arms and flashing a sickeningly familiar smirk. He couldn't perceive the elite forensic accountant sitting across the aisle. He only saw the discarded, invisible sister he assumed was staging a desperate, pathetic stunt for attention. He leaned across the polished oak table, his voice a harsh, mocking whisper designed to trigger me. He called me a bitter, jealous outsider, claiming I was just throwing a tantrum to stay relevant in a legacy that had rightfully moved on without me. I didn't flinch. I didn't defend myself. 10 years ago, that precise brand of psychological warfare would have completely bankrupted my emotional reserves. Today, it was just irrelevant background noise. Tyler was projecting his own massive liability onto me. He was attempting to assert dominance, but I recognized it as the desperate, pathetic flailing of a hopelessly over-leveraged debtor. I looked right through his performance. I wasn't there to renegotiate a broken sibling relationship. I was there to liquidate his entire operation. Right on cue, Maria, my father's high-priced private nurse, stepped in to protect the primary investment. She hovered aggressively over Richard's wheelchair like a fiercely territorial guard dog, theatrically adjusting his collar and checking his pulse. She glared at me with calculated hostility, leaning over the wooden partition to whisper aggressively to Gregory, making sure her voice was loud enough for our table to hear. She claimed that my toxic presence was dangerously stressing his fragile heart, expertly weaponizing compassion to frame my legal filing as a physical assault on a vulnerable old man. Maria and Tyler had clearly formed a highly lucrative joint venture, a parasitic alliance actively bleeding my father's remaining assets dry. Unfazed by the judge's initial ruling, they aggressively doubled down. Tyler's attorney slid a dense, aggressively drafted legal document across the centre aisle toward me. It was a voluntary forfeiture waiver. Tyler, emboldened by Maria's dramatic medical warnings, demanded that I sign away any and all future legal claims to the estate immediately. They framed the immediate surrender of my legal rights as a necessary medical intervention for my father's survival. In reality, it was a crude, heavy-handed attempt at a hostile buyout designed to permanently eliminate the last remaining shareholder who could legally demand an audit of the estate. They fully expected me to crumble under the suffocating weight of weaponized family guilt and public humiliation. They calculated that their synchronized cruelty would force me into a rapid, unconditional settlement just to escape the room. But their toxic escalation achieved the exact opposite. It permanently removed the final, lingering fractions of hesitation I might have subconsciously harbored. They weren't damaged people making emotional mistakes. They were predatory actors operating with malicious, calculated intent. Their absolute lack of remorse was the ultimate moral green light. My empathy account had been completely zeroed out. Inside, my mind glowed with a different kind of sunrise, one made entirely of facts, numbers, and quiet retribution. I didn't reach for their pen. I simply reached back into my briefcase. I stood up, leaving their pathetic waiver untouched on the table. The time for family drama had officially expired. We were now moving into clinical, professional execution. I pulled a second, significantly heavier file from my briefcase. This was a meticulously tabbed 300-page forensic dossier. I bypassed Tyler entirely and handed it directly to Gregory, my father's longtime corporate attorney, a man who had historically rubber-stamped my father's every tyrannical whim. Gregory opened the thick binder. I didn't raise my voice. I spoke with the calm, factual precision of a lethal corporate auditor. I directed his attention to tab 4. I outlined exactly how 12 highly profitable commercial warehouses in the Boston Harbor had been quietly decoupled from the parent company and transferred into anonymous Delaware shell entities. I didn't need to guess who owned the LLCs. I already had the incorporation documents proving Tyler was the sole managing member. Then I instructed Gregory to flip to tab 7. I watched Maria's smug expression instantly evaporate as I detailed exactly $450,000 in unauthorized bonus wire transfers. The funds had been systematically routed from a corporate logistics account directly into Maria's personal offshore trust. Gregory went entirely pale. As a fiduciary, he was suddenly staring down the barrel of massive federal compliance violations. The courtroom air felt heavy, vacuumed of all oxygen, as the attorney realized the magnitude of the exposure. But the financial theft was merely the preamble to the true criminal twist. I instructed Gregory to open the final red-tabbed section of the dossier. For 17 years, I believed my mother had been fully complicit in my banishment. I thought she had simply stood by and watched as my father threw me away. But my forensic audit had unearthed something hidden deep within the foundational code of the family trust. A secondary, encrypted addendum drafted by my mother mere days before she passed away. My mother had lived her entire life as the silent watchman of our family, trapped in a relentless psychological battle against my father's overwhelming tyranny. She had played the dutiful, subservient wife on the surface, absorbing his cruelty to keep the peace. But watching me get exiled had broken her. In her final days, consumed by the agonizing, silent regret of not fighting for me, she orchestrated one desperate, brilliant act of rebellion. She didn't leave me a sentimental letter or empty apologies. She left me legally binding leverage. Operating completely behind my father's back, she had utilized her jointly held trust assets to secretly restructure the master trust. She quietly embedded a fail-safe mechanism protecting the daughter who had been cast out. I looked directly at my father, delivering the final, fatal clause. The encrypted addendum granted me absolute, irrevocable veto power over the liquidation of any major estate asset. Tyler couldn't sell a single warehouse, and my father couldn't move a single cargo ship without my explicit, notarized signature. They had spent years assuming I was permanently locked out of the empire. They were completely wrong. My mother had given me the only set of master keys. The power dynamic inside the courtroom didn't just shift, it violently and irreversibly inverted. The moment I revealed my mother's encrypted addendum and my irrevocable veto power, the smug, impenetrable armor Tyler had worn for 40 years instantly shattered. He wasn't looking at a manageable sibling rivalry anymore. He was staring directly down the barrel of a multi-million-dollar federal wire fraud indictment, and he suddenly realized he had absolutely zero equity to buy his way out. I watched him collapse in real time, transitioning from an arrogant corporate executive to a pathetic, terrified liability. This is the fundamental structural flaw of the golden child. I had spent 17 years in exile, building my foundation on hard assets like marketable skills, relentless resilience, and unyielding discipline. Tyler, on the other hand, had built his entire identity on the illusion of power from an empty wallet. His confidence was nothing more than a fragile, hollow shell, manufactured entirely by unearned wealth and my father's blind validation. When you strip away the stolen capital, there is no underlying value left to leverage. The moment the limitless funding was legally frozen, the terrifying, undeniable reality of his own incompetence crushed him under its weight. Panic flooded Tyler's flushed face. He turned desperately to our father, his hands gripping the armrest of the wheelchair. He began begging the old man to call off the lawyers, to leverage his political connections, to protect his primary investment one last time. But Richard Carter didn't move. My father sat perfectly still, his breathing shallow, completely paralyzed by a devastating, compounding realization. The mighty shipping empire he had sacrificed his own daughter to protect wasn't just dying a natural death, it had been actively butchered by the very son he had unconditionally worshipped. For the first time in his long, tyrannical life, my father realized he was fundamentally bankrupt, thoroughly manipulated, and entirely dependent on a man who had been robbing him blind for half a decade. When Tyler realized that his ultimate financial safety net had completely dissolved, his panic instantly mutated into vicious, cornered malice. The golden child violently turned on his primary investor. Tyler stepped back from the wheelchair, his voice cracking as he screamed at our father, declaring that the old man deserved every single stolen dollar. He blamed my father for being a weak, pathetic fool who was too blind to see his own life's work being liquidated right out from under him. The pristine, highly manicured illusion of the perfect, loyal family imploded right in front of the judge, the clerk, and the gallery, leaving nothing but toxic, worthless debris. Maria silently backed away from the defendant's table, already calculating the massive overhead of her own criminal defense, entirely abandoning the frail man she had violently sworn to protect just minutes prior. Through all the screaming, the profound betrayal, and the utter destruction of the Carter legacy, I remained perfectly still, icy, and entirely unbothered. I didn't feel a surge of vindictive joy, and I didn't feel a single ounce of pity. This wasn't revenge. It was strict accounting. The ledgers were simply balancing themselves. I sat quietly, looking down at the men who had so ruthlessly banished me, watching them drown in the exact same toxic liability they had spent 17 years cultivating. The legal fallout following the civil hearing was clinical, swift, and absolute. Because I had simultaneously forwarded my dossier to the SEC and the FBI, Tyler was formally indicted on 22 federal counts of wire fraud, embezzlement, and corporate malfeasance. His empty arrogance could not negotiate a plea deal, and he was currently sitting in a holding facility awaiting sentencing. Maria did not fare much better. The moment the unauthorized transfers were officially flagged, the federal authorities froze her offshore trust, placing her under a massive criminal investigation for both elder exploitation and international tax evasion. As for my father, he was left physically safe but entirely emotionally bankrupt. Stripped of his leverage and facing massive corporate restructuring, he was forced to step down from the shipping empire he had sacrificed his own soul to build. He retreated to a deeply lonely, sprawling estate on Cape Cod. He was completely isolated in a massive fortress of his own making, surrounded only by the ghosts of the family he had deliberately destroyed. I visited him exactly one last time. I did not go to gloat, and I certainly did not go to reconcile. I found him sitting in a massive darkened study, looking incredibly small. The terrifying tyrant who used to command boardrooms with a single glance was gone. In his place was a frail, shattered man who finally understood the true, devastating cost of his transactions. He looked at me, tears welling in his aged eyes, and attempted a broken, trembling apology. He reached out, desperately trying to secure a lifeline that no longer existed. I did not interrupt him. I did not yell. I did not offer him the validation of my anger, nor did I offer him the comfort of my forgiveness. I simply reached into my briefcase one last time, pulled out the fully restored trust documents, and placed them gently on the mahogany table. My mother's legacy was officially secure. I looked at him in total silence, turned around, and walked out of the heavy oak doors, closing them firmly behind me. I used to believe that walking away from your family was the ultimate failure. Society constantly conditions us to believe that bloodlines are unbreakable, sacred contracts, and that we owe our absolute loyalty to people simply because we share their DNA. But navigating this incredibly dark chapter taught me the exact opposite. I've come to realize that some bloodlines are just toxic supply chains. Letting go of an abusive, manipulative family dynamic is not an act of betrayal. It is a fundamental, non-negotiable act of survival. You cannot heal in the exact same environment that fundamentally broke you. You cannot save people who are violently determined to destroy you just to maintain their own pathetic illusion of control. Closing the door on my father and my brother was not a loss. It was the exact moment I finally reclaimed my own identity. If you find yourself in a similar situation, remember that your internal peace is not a depreciating asset meant to be leveraged by others. You have the absolute right to close the account on people who continually overdraft your emotional reserves without ever making a deposit. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's simply the final signature required to set yourself free from their balance sheet forever. If this story resonated with you, or if you've ever had to find the courage to walk away from a toxic dynamic to protect your own peace, hit the like button and share this video with someone who might need to hear it today. Stay strong, and I'll see you in the next story.